The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It hammered against the stone walls of the palace kitchen with a relentless fury that matched the ache in Lyra's chest. She knelt on the cold floor, her knees pressed against the unforgiving stone, her thin dress soaked through from the water she had spilled while scrubbing the massive iron pots that lined the kitchen's edge. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding in places where the lye soap had eaten through what little protection her flesh could offer. She did not cry out. She had learned long ago that crying out only made things worse. The kitchen was empty now, the other servants having abandoned their posts once the head cook dismissed them for the evening. Lyra had been ordered to stay behind, to finish the work that 3 others had left undone, because she was expendable, because she had no voice, because no one would question why the beta's daughter was treated worse than the lowest scullery maid. She pressed her forehead against the cold rim of the pot she was scrubbing, and allowed herself a single, shuddering breath. The metal smelled of old grease and ash, and beneath it all was the faint, lingering scent of rosemary from the evening meal she had helped prepare, but would never taste. Her parents were dead. That single truth had defined the last 4 years of her existence. Her father, the loyal beta who had served Alpha King Darius with unwavering devotion, had died under circumstances that no one would explain to her. One night he had kissed her forehead and told her he would return by morning. He never did. 3 days later, his body was found in the forest beyond the palace grounds, his throat torn open, his eyes frozen in an expression of shock that haunted Lyra's dreams. Her mother had followed him into death 6 months later, her heart simply giving out, the healer said, though Lyra knew it was grief that had killed her. Grief and the knowledge that whatever secrets her husband had carried to his grave would never be avenged. Lyra had been 13 when she became an orphan. 13 when the Alpha King, out of what she assumed was pity or obligation, had allowed her to remain in the palace. She had been given a small room in the servants' quarters, a narrow bed with a thin blanket, and the promise that she would be cared for. But care, she learned quickly, was not the same as protection. Care meant she was fed the scraps left over after the pack had eaten their fill. Care meant she was given the heaviest work, the most dangerous tasks, the assignments that left her exhausted and aching by nightfall. Care meant that when members of the rival faction within the pack decided she was a convenient target for their cruelty, no one intervened. She did not know when it had started exactly. Perhaps it had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for her father's death to remove the one shield she had ever possessed. The first time one of them cornered her in the storage room, she had thought it was a mistake. The man had gripped her arm too tightly, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow, and demanded to know where her father had hidden his documents. Lyra had stared at him in confusion. Documents? She knew nothing of documents. Her father had never spoken of his work to her, had never involved her in the politics of the pack. But the man had not believed her. He had shaken her until her teeth rattled and then shoved her against the wall hard enough to leave bruises that took weeks to fade. After that, the incidents became more frequent. A shove in the hallway, a whispered threat in the dark, hands that grabbed her when she was alone, voices that hissed accusations she did not understand. They believed she knew something, that her father had entrusted her with secrets that could destroy them. And perhaps he had. Lyra did not know. She had been a child when he died, more concerned with her studies and her dreams of becoming a healer than with the dangerous games of power that consumed the adult world around her. But ignorance was not a defense. Ignorance did not stop them from hurting her. The scars on her arms were a testament to their persistence. Some were thin and white, long-heeled, the result of a blade pressed against her skin in warning. Others were newer, red and angry, the product of fresh cruelty. She had learned to hide them beneath long sleeves, to invent stories about accidents in the kitchen or clumsiness with the firewood. No one questioned her explanations. No one cared enough to question them. She was the orphaned daughter of a dead beta, a ghost haunting the palace, invisible to everyone who mattered, except perhaps to the Alpha King himself. Darius had always been a distant figure in Lyra's life, even before her parents died. He was a man carved from stone and shadow, his face marked by the scars of 100 battles. his eyes cold and unreadable. He ruled with absolute authority, his word law, his presence commanding a respect that bordered on fear. Lyra had seen him only a handful of times since her father's death, always from a distance, always in passing. He had never spoken to her directly, had never acknowledged her existence beyond the initial decree that she could remain in the palace. She did not blame him for his indifference. He was a king, burdened with the weight of an entire pack, and she was nothing. But sometimes, late at night when the palace was silent and the darkness pressed in around her, Lyra would remember the way her father had spoken of Darius, with reverence, with loyalty, with a love that transcended duty. Her father had believed in the Alpha King, had trusted him with his life, and Lyra clung to that memory like a lifeline. If her father had believed in Darius, then perhaps there was something in the man worth believing in. Perhaps, if she could only survive long enough, the Alpha King would one day see her suffering and put an end to it. But that day had not come, and Lyra was no longer certain it ever would. The sound of footsteps echoing through the kitchen startled her out of her thoughts. She straightened quickly, her heart leaping into her throat, and grabbed the scrub brush with trembling hands. If one of the cooks had returned and found her idle, she would be punished. She bent over the pot again, scrubbing with renewed vigor, ignoring the way the lye burned her already damaged skin. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Lyra's pulse quickened. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the pot, praying that whoever it was would pass by without noticing her. But the footsteps stopped. Lyra froze, her hands stilling on the brush. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the walls. She could feel the weight of someone's gaze on her, heavy and assessing, and her stomach twisted into knots. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head. Alpha King Darius stood in the doorway. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had never been this close to him before, had never seen the full intensity of his presence without the buffer of distance or a crowd of people between them. He was taller than she remembered, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark hair damp from the rain. He wore simple travel clothes, the leather stained with mud, and there was an exhaustion in the set of his jaw that spoke of long days on the road. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, almost black in the dim light of the kitchen, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lyra's mind raced, trying to understand why the Alpha King was here, in the kitchen at this late hour. He had been away on a diplomatic mission, she knew, gone for nearly a month. She had not expected him to return so soon, and certainly not to find her here, alone, in the bowels of the palace where no one of importance ever ventured. Darius took a step forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Lyra flinched, the motion instinctive, and immediately regretted it. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of emotion too quick to identify, and then his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that commanded obedience without needing to shout. Lyra swallowed hard, her throat dry. I was finishing the evening work, Your Majesty." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, thin and fragile, and she hated herself for it. She had once been stronger than this, braver, but 4 years of cruelty had worn her down, had stripped away the girl she had been, and left behind only this trembling shadow. Darius's gaze swept over the kitchen, taking in the rows of dirty pots, the buckets of water, the scrub brush clutched in her reddened hands. His jaw tightened. "Alone?" "Yes, Your Majesty." He was silent for a moment, and then he moved closer. Lyra's heart hammered in her chest. She did not know what he wanted, did not understand why he was here, and the uncertainty was almost worse than the pain she had grown accustomed to. She wanted to run, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged, but her legs refused to move. She was frozen, trapped by the weight of his attention, unable to do anything but wait. Darius stopped a few feet away from her. This close, Lyra could see the lines of fatigue etched into his face, the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in days, who carried burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. And yet, despite his exhaustion, There was a sharpness to his gaze that missed nothing. "Stand up," he said quietly. Lyra obeyed, her knees protesting as she pushed herself to her feet. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands clasped in front of her, the picture of submission. She did not know what else to do. Darius studied her in silence, and Lyra felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. She was acutely aware of how she must look to him. Filthy, bedraggled, her dress clinging to her thin frame, her hair falling in tangled strands around her face. She was a disgrace, a reminder of everything the pack had lost when her father died. She did not blame Darius for whatever disgust he must feel, but when he spoke again, his tone was not disgusted. It was something else, something she could not quite identify. "You're shaking." Lyra blinked, startled. She had not realized it, but he was right. Her entire body was trembling, her hands quivering where they were clasped in front of her. She tried to still the motion, to regain some semblance of control, but it was no use. The cold, the exhaustion, the fear, it all crashed over her at once, and she could not stop the tremors that racked her frame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she did not know what she was apologizing for being weak, for being here, for existing. Darius took another step forward, and Lyra instinctively pulled her arms closer to her body. The motion was small, defensive, but it did not escape his notice. His eyes narrowed, and before Lyra could react, he reached out and caught her wrist. The touch was not rough, but it was firm, inescapable. Lyra gasped, her eyes flying up to meet his, and in that moment she saw something shift in his expression. His gaze dropped to her arm, to the place where his fingers encircled her wrist, and then to the exposed skin of her forearm where the sleeve of her dress had ridden up. The scars were visible, thin white lines crisscrossed with newer, angrier marks, some still scabbed over, evidence of wounds that had been reopened again and again. Lyra's breath hitched, panic flooding through her. She tried to pull away, to hide the evidence of her suffering, but Darius's grip tightened, not painfully, but enough to hold her in place. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply stared at her arm, his expression unreadable, and Lyra felt the seconds stretch into an eternity. She wanted to explain, to offer some excuse, but the words would not come. What could she say? That she was clumsy? That she had fallen? He would not believe her. No one ever did. When Darius finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Who did this to you?" Lyra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She could not answer him. She could not tell him the truth, could not expose the men who had tormented her, because to do so would be to invite even greater suffering. They would know she had betrayed them. They would make her pay. And the Alpha King, for all his power, could not be everywhere at once. He could not protect her from shadows. Lyra. Her name on his lips was a command, sharp and unyielding. "Who did this?" She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No one, Your Majesty. I'm clumsy. I fell." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, and she knew he did not believe her. His eyes searched hers, and in them she saw something she had never expected to see. Fury. Not directed at her, but at someone, at the faceless cruelty that had left her scarred and broken. And beneath the fury, there was something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Darius released her wrist slowly, carefully, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter her completely. He stepped back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, and Lyra could see the tension radiating from him, the barely leashed rage that threatened to break free. For a moment, she thought he might leave, might walk away and forget this encounter, forget her. But then he spoke again, and his words were laced with a quiet, terrible promise. "This ends now." Lyra stared at him, confusion and hope warring in her chest. She did not understand what he meant, did not dare to believe that he could truly put an end to her suffering. But there was something in his voice, in the set of his shoulders, that told her he was not making an idle vow. Darius turned away from her, his gaze sweeping the kitchen one last time before settling on her again. "Come with me." "Your Majesty, That was not a request. Lyra's protests died in her throat. She nodded mutely and followed him as he strode out of the kitchen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She did not know where he was taking her, did not know what would happen next. All she knew was that for the first time in 4 years, someone had seen her suffering. Someone had cared. And that someone was the Alpha King himself. They walked through the dimly lit corridors of the palace, Darius's long strides forcing Lyra to nearly run to keep up. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, the sound filling the silence between them. Servants they passed stared openly, their eyes wide with shock at the sight of the Alpha King walking alongside the orphaned daughter of his beta. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her cheeks burning with shame. She did not belong here, walking these halls as if she were someone of importance. She was a ghost, and ghosts were meant to remain unseen. But Darius did not seem to care about propriety or appearances. He led her through the palace with single-minded determination, his jaw set, his eyes forward. They climbed a staircase Lyra had never been permitted to use, the one reserved for members of the royal household, and her anxiety spiked. Where was he taking her? What did he intend to do? Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door at the end of a long hallway. Darius pushed it open without ceremony and stepped inside, motioning for Lyra to follow. She hesitated for only a moment before obeying, crossing the threshold into a room that took her breath away. It was a study, or perhaps a sitting room, furnished with dark wood and deep colors. A fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the scent of leather and parchment filled the air. It was warm here, blessedly warm, and Lyra felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. She had not realized how cold she had been until now. Darius closed the door behind them and gestured toward one of the chairs near the fire. "Sit." Lyra obeyed, sinking into the chair with a gratitude she could not put into words. The warmth of the fire seeped into her chilled bones, and for a moment she simply closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel safe. It was an illusion, she knew, but it was a comforting one. When she opened her eyes again, Darius was standing by the window, his back to her, staring out at the rain-soaked night. The silence stretched between them, heavy and expectant, and Lyra did not know how to break it. She clasped her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously, and waited. Finally, Darius spoke. "How long has this been happening?" Lyra's throat tightened. She did not want to answer, did not want to relive the months of torment, but she could not lie to him. Not now. Not when he had seen the truth written on her skin. "Since my father died," she whispered. Darius's shoulders stiffened, but he did not turn around. "And you said nothing." It was not a question, but Lyra answered anyway. I didn't think anyone would believe me, or care." The words hung in the air between them, stark and painful. Darius turned then, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she did not. She met his eyes and saw the storm raging within them. "I care," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice shook her to her core. Lyra's breath caught. She did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to the weight of that admission. The Alpha King cared. The man who ruled with iron and shadow, who had never spared her a glance, cared. Darius crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her level. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. A king did not kneel. A king did not lower himself for anyone. And yet here he was, his dark eyes fixed on hers, his expression fierce and unyielding. "Tell me their names," he said quietly. "Tell me who did this to you, and I will make them pay." Lyra shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't. They'll hurt me worse." They will never touch you again?" The conviction in his voice was absolute, unshakable. "I swear it on my life, Lyra. Tell me their names." And so she did. Haltingly, painfully, she told him everything. The names of the men who had cornered her, who had threatened her, who had demanded to know about documents she did not understand. She told him about the scars, about the fear that had become her constant companion, about the nights she had lain awake wondering if she would survive until morning. She told him everything, and with each word, she felt a weight lifting from her chest. When she finished, Darius was silent. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle ticking beneath his skin, and his hands were fisted on his thighs. He looked like a man on the edge of violence, barely restrained, and Lyra felt a flicker of fear, not for herself, but for what he might do. "Your father," Darius said finally, his voice rough. "He was protecting something. Documents that could have exposed the faction's plans to overthrow me. I never knew he had hidden them. I never knew they were still searching for them." Lyra's heart clenched. "I don't have them. I don't know where they are. But they think you do." Darius's gaze bore into hers. "They think your father told you where to find them." "He didn't. He never said anything. I was just a child." Darius nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Then we will find them before they do, and we will end this." Lyra wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could protect her, that he could put an end to the nightmare her life had become. But hope was a dangerous thing, and she had learned long ago not to trust it. Still, when Darius reached out and gently took her hand in his, she did not pull away. She let him hold her, let him anchor her, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not alone. The dawn came cold and gray, the rain having finally ceased sometime in the early hours of the morning. Lyra woke in a bed that was not her own, in a room she did not recognize, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, her mind struggling to orient itself, to separate dream from reality. Then the memories of the previous night came flooding back, and she sat up with a gasp. She was in the Alpha King's private quarters. He had brought her here after their conversation in his study, had insisted she sleep somewhere safe, somewhere the men who had tormented her could not reach her. Lyra had protested weakly, aware of the scandal it would cause if anyone discovered she had spent the night in the king's chambers, but Darius had silenced her objections with a single look. He had shown her to a guest room adjoining his own, had ordered a servant to bring her clean clothes and water for washing, and had stood guard outside her door until she had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. Now, in the pale light of morning, Lyra felt the full weight of her situation pressing down on her. The Alpha King knew her secret. He had seen her scars, had heard the names of her tormentors, had sworn to protect her. But what did that mean? What would happen now? Would he confront the men who had hurt her? Would he punish them? And if he did, what would the consequences be for her? The faction was powerful, their influence reaching deep into the pack's hierarchy. They would not take kindly to being exposed, and Lyra feared their retaliation more than she feared their initial cruelty. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Lyra's heart leaped into her throat, and she pulled the blankets up to her chin, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. "Yes?" she called out, her voice trembling. The door opened, and a woman entered carrying a tray laden with food. She was middle-aged, her face lined but kind, and she wore the simple dress of a palace servant. Lyra recognized her vaguely, one of the housekeepers perhaps, though they had never spoken before. The woman set the tray down on the small table near the window and turned to Lyra with a warm smile. "Good morning, miss. His Majesty requested that you be brought breakfast. He said you're to eat and then meet him in his study when you're ready." The woman's eyes were curious but not unkind, and Lyra wondered how much she knew, how much the Alpha King had told her. "Thank you," Lyra murmured, her cheeks flushing. She felt like an imposter sitting here, being served as if she were someone of importance. She was not. She was the daughter of a dead beta, a girl who scrubbed pots in the kitchen. She did not deserve this kindness. The woman hesitated at the door, her expression thoughtful. "Miss, if I may, His Majesty has not looked at anyone the way he looked at you last night in many years. Whatever burdens you carry, I think you'll find he's willing to share them." With that cryptic statement, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Lyra stared after her, her mind reeling. What did that mean? The Alpha King had looked at her with fury, with determination, but surely not with anything beyond that. He pitied her, perhaps, felt obligated to help her because of her father's service. But that was all. Anything more was impossible. She was nobody. Still, the woman's words lingered in her mind as she forced herself out of bed and approached the tray. The food was simple but abundant: fresh bread, soft cheese, sliced fruit, and a pot of steaming tea. Lyra's stomach growled at the sight of it, reminding her that she had not eaten properly in days. She sat down and ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about the conversation that awaited her. When she finished, she washed her face and hands in the basin that had been left for her and changed into the clean dress the servant had brought the night before. It was plain but well made, far nicer than anything she had worn in years, and it fit her surprisingly well. Lyra ran her fingers over the soft fabric and felt a pang of something she could not name. Gratitude, perhaps, or hope, or fear that this fragile kindness would be ripped away as quickly as it had been given. Taking a deep breath, she left the room and made her way to the study where she had poured out her heart the night before. The palace was beginning to stir, servants moving through the hallways with quiet efficiency, but Lyra kept her head down and avoided eye contact. She did not want to see the questions in their eyes, did not want to face the whispers that were surely already spreading through the pack. When she reached the study, she found the door slightly ajar. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the wood, and then knocked softly. "Your Majesty, come in." Darius's voice was firm, but not unkind. Lyra pushed the door open and stepped inside. The Alpha King was standing at his desk, bent over a collection of maps and documents that were spread across the surface. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment their eyes met. In the daylight, Lyra could see the exhaustion etched into his face more clearly, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He had not rested. He had spent the hours working, planning, and Lyra felt a surge of guilt. She had caused this. Her suffering had become his burden. "Sit," Darius said, gesturing to the chair she had occupied the night before. Lyra obeyed, folding her hands in her lap and waiting. The fire had been rebuilt, and the room was warm, but she still felt cold, a chill that came from deep within. Darius straightened and came around the desk to stand before her. He did not sit, did not soften his posture, and Lyra realized with a start that he was preparing for something. A confrontation, perhaps, or a revelation. "I spent the night reviewing your father's records," he began, his voice measured. He was meticulous, as always. Every mission, every conversation, every suspicion, he documented it all. And buried within those documents, I found references to a cache of evidence he had been collecting. Proof of the faction's plans to overthrow me, to destabilize the pack from within. He never had the chance to bring it to me before he died. Lyra's breath hitched. He knew they were planning to betray you? He suspected, and he was gathering proof to confirm those suspicions. Darius's jaw tightened. He died before he could finish, and the faction has been searching for that evidence ever since, terrified that it will surface and expose them. "But I don't have it," Lyra said desperately. "I swear, I don't know where it is." "I believe you." Darius's gaze softened slightly. "But they don't. And that's why they've been tormenting you. They think your father told you where to find it, or that you have it hidden somewhere. They're trying to break you, to force you to give it up." Lyra felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I would have given it to them if I had it. I would have done anything to make them stop." "I know." Darius's voice was gentle now, almost tender. "And that's why I'm going to find it before they do. Your father left clues. Breadcrumbs that only someone who knew him well would understand. I knew him better than anyone, Lyra. I will find what he hid, and I will use it to destroy the men who hurt you." The conviction in his words was absolute, and Lyra felt something inside her shift. This was not pity. This was not obligation. This was a man who had been betrayed, who had failed to protect someone under his care, and who was determined to make amends. She did not know what to do with that knowledge, did not know how to process the intensity of his focus on her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. Darius studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to tell me everything you remember about your father in the months before he died. Any strange behavior, any unusual requests, any places he visited that seemed out of the ordinary, anything at all." Lyra nodded slowly, her mind racing back through the fog of memory. She had been so young then, only 13, still innocent and unaware of the dangers that surrounded her. But she tried to focus, to sift through the fragments of the past for anything that might help. "He used to take me to the forest," she said finally. "Not the hunting grounds, but deeper, to places where the old trees grow. He said it was important to know the land, to understand the history of the pack. We would walk for hours, and he would tell me stories about the ancestors, about the battles they fought and the sacrifices they made." She paused, a memory surfacing. There was one place he always stopped, a clearing with a massive oak tree at its center. He called it the Sentinel. He said it had been there longer than the pack itself, that it held the memory of everything that had ever happened in these lands. Darius's eyes sharpened. "The Sentinel. I know it. Your father and I used to meet there when we were younger, before I became Alpha. It was our place, somewhere we could speak freely without being overheard." He straightened, his mind clearly working through possibilities. If he hid something, it would be there. It has to be. "But how?" Lyra asked. "It's just a tree. Your father was clever. He would have found a way." Darius moved back to his desk and began rolling up the maps. "We leave at first light tomorrow. I'll take you to the Sentinel, and we'll search it together." Lyra's heart pounded. "You're taking me with you?" "Yes." Darius looked up, and there was no room for argument in his expression. "You're not safe here, Lyra. The faction knows I've taken an interest in you now. They'll be watching, waiting for an opportunity to get to you. The only way to keep you safe is to keep you with me." The thought of leaving the palace, of venturing into the forest with the Alpha King, filled Lyra with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had not left the palace grounds in 4 years, had not breathed free air or felt the sun on her face without the oppressive weight of her captivity pressing down on her. But she was also terrified. What if they found nothing? What if her father's clues led nowhere? What if the faction discovered what they were doing and came after them? As if reading her thoughts, Darius crossed the room and knelt before her once again, just as he had the night before. He took her hands in his touch warm and steady, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that stole her breath. "I will not let them hurt you again," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I failed you once, Lyra. I failed to see what was happening under my own roof, failed to protect you when you needed it most. I will not fail you again. Do you understand?" Lyra could only nod, tears spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in his strength and his promises. But trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, and she had learned the hard way not to place her faith in others. Still, as she looked into Darius's eyes and saw the raw determination there, she felt something inside her begin to thaw. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was different. Perhaps he would keep his word. "I understand," she whispered. Darius held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he released her hands and stood. "Good. Now, I have arrangements to make. You'll stay here in my quarters until we leave. I don't want you wandering the palace alone. If you need anything, ask the servants. They've been instructed to see to your every need. But the others, they'll talk. They'll think. Let them think what they want." Darius's tone brooked no argument. "Your safety is more important than gossip. Besides, I am the Alpha King. I answer to no one." With that, he strode out of the room, leaving Lyra alone with her thoughts. She sat in the chair by the fire, her hands still tingling from the warmth of his touch, and tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of a single night, her entire world had shifted. She was no longer invisible, no longer alone. The Alpha King himself had taken her under his protection, had sworn to find the evidence her father had hidden, and to bring her tormentors to justice. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. But hope, she knew, was a dangerous thing. It could lift you up, give you the strength to keep going, but it could also destroy you when it was taken away. And Lyra had been destroyed too many times already. She spent the rest of the day in the study, reading from the books that lined the shelves and trying to keep her mind occupied. Servants came and went, bringing her meals and fresh water, but none of them spoke beyond pleasantries, and Lyra was grateful for the silence. She did not want to answer questions, did not want to explain what she was doing in the Alpha King's private chambers. As evening fell, Darius returned. He looked even more exhausted than before, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight. He barely acknowledged her presence as he moved to his desk and began sorting through papers with a focused intensity that made Lyra hesitant to interrupt. She watched him from her place by the fire, noting the way his hands moved with precision, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who carried the weight of an entire pack on his shoulders, and it showed in every line of his body. After a long while, he looked up and seemed surprised to find her still there. "You should eat," he said, gesturing to the tray that had been brought for her, "and then rest. We have a long journey ahead of us tomorrow." "Have you eaten?" Lyra asked before she could stop herself. Darius blinked, as if the question had caught him off guard. No, I haven't had time." "Then eat with me." The words were out before Lyra could think better of them, and she immediately regretted her boldness. Who was she to command the Alpha King to do anything? But to her surprise, Darius did not seem offended. Instead, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had ever seen from him. Very well. He joined her at the small table, and they ate in companionable silence. Lyra found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the fearsome ruler she had heard about with the man sitting across from her. He was still intimidating, still carried an aura of power that made her heart race. But there was something else there too, a weariness, a vulnerability. He was not invincible, she realized. He was just a man, doing his best to carry an impossible burden. When the meal was finished, Darius stood and moved back to his desk. "Get some rest, Lyra. We leave at dawn." Lyra nodded and rose from her seat. She hesitated at the door to the guest room, then turned back. "Your Majesty?" He looked up. "Yes? Thank you. For everything." Darius held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she could not name. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "We still have a long road ahead of us." Lyra nodded and retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling, her mind whirling with thoughts and emotions she could not untangle. Tomorrow they would leave the palace and venture into the forest in search of her father's hidden evidence. Tomorrow her life would change again, in ways she could not predict. And tomorrow, for the first time in 4 years, she would not be alone. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, her dreams were not filled with fear. The journey to the forest began before the sun had fully risen. Lyra woke to the sound of movement in the outer chamber and dressed quickly in the sturdy travel clothes that had been left for her. When she emerged, she found Darius already prepared, a pack slung over his shoulder, his expression grim and focused. He handed her a cloak and a pair of worn boots, and she put them on without question. They left the palace through a side entrance, avoiding the main halls where servants and pack members were beginning their morning routines. Lyra was grateful for the discretion. She did not want to face the stares and whispers that would surely follow if anyone saw them leaving together. Outside, the air was crisp and cold, the sky a pale gray that promised rain later in the day. 2 horses were waiting for them, saddled and ready, and Lyra's stomach clenched with nervousness. She had not ridden in years, not since before her father died. Darius must have noticed her hesitation because he moved to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll ride with me," he said simply. "It's safer and faster." Lyra nodded, relief flooding through her. She watched as Darius mounted his horse with practiced ease and then extended his hand to her. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him, settling her against his back. The warmth of his body seeped through her cloak, and she found herself acutely aware of every point of contact between them. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on tightly as he urged the horse forward. They rode in silence through the palace grounds and into the forest beyond. The trees loomed tall and dark around them, their branches heavy with the remnants of the rain. The path Darius took was narrow and winding, clearly not one of the main roads, and Lyra realized he was being cautious, avoiding places where they might be seen or followed. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a bird overhead. As they rode deeper into the woods, Lyra felt the tension in her body begin to ease. There was something peaceful about the forest, something ancient and unchanging that made her feel small but not insignificant. She remembered the walks she had taken with her father, the way he had taught her to read the signs of the forest, to understand its rhythms and secrets. Those memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the pain of loss, but they also brought a strange comfort. Her father had loved this place. He had trusted it with his secrets, and now she and Darius were following in his footsteps, trying to uncover what he had left behind. After what felt like hours, Darius slowed the horse and dismounted. He helped Lyra down, and she looked around, trying to orient herself. They were in a part of the forest she did not recognize, the trees so thick that the sky was barely visible through the canopy. But then she saw it, the massive oak tree standing in the center of a clearing, its trunk wider than 3 men standing side by side, its branches reaching toward the heavens like gnarled fingers. The sentinel. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. It was just as she remembered, ancient and imposing, a silent witness to centuries of history. She moved toward it slowly, almost reverently, and placed her hand on the rough bark. It was cool to the touch, solid and unyielding, and she felt a strange sense of connection to it, as if it held the memory of her father within its depths. Darius joined her, his gaze fixed on the tree. "Your father and I used to carve our initials into the bark when we were boys," he said quietly. "Somewhere near the base, if I remember correctly." He knelt down and began searching, his fingers tracing the gnarled surface. Lyra knelt beside him, and together they searched, looking for any sign that her father had left something behind. It took nearly an hour, but finally Darius made a sound of triumph. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot where the bark had been carefully cut away and then replaced. It was so subtle that Lyra would never have noticed it on her own, but once Darius pointed it out, she could see the faint outline of a hidden compartment. Darius pulled a knife from his belt and carefully pried the bark away, revealing a small hollow carved into the trunk. Inside was a leather pouch, worn and stained with age. Darius pulled it out and opened it, and Lyra's heart pounded as she watched him remove a collection of folded papers and a small pendant on a silver chain. "This is it," Darius said, his voice tight with emotion. "This is what your father hid." Lyra stared at the pendant, recognition dawning. "I've seen that before," she whispered. "My father wore it. He gave it to me the night before he died, told me to keep it safe. But I lost it. Or I thought I did. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find it." Darius held the pendant up to the light, examining it closely. "It's not just a pendant," he said slowly. "Look." He pressed a hidden clasp on the side, and the pendant opened, revealing a tiny compartment inside. Within it was a rolled piece of parchment, so small it could barely be seen. He unrolled it carefully, and Lyra leaned in to read the tiny script. It was a list of names, dates, and locations, evidence of meetings, transactions, and plans that painted a damning picture of the faction's conspiracy. Her father had documented everything, had risked his life to gather this proof, and he had hidden it in the one place only someone who truly knew him would think to look. "This is enough," Darius said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "This is more than enough to bring them down." Lyra felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. Pride, grief, relief. Her father had not died in vain. He had left behind the means to bring justice, to protect the pack he had loved so dearly. And now, finally, his sacrifice would mean something. Darius carefully folded the papers and placed them back in the pouch, along with the pendant. He looked at Lyra, and in his eyes she saw a promise. "We end this today." They did not return to the palace immediately. Darius led Lyra deeper into the forest, away from the sentinel and the main paths, until they reached a small cabin hidden among the dense trees. It was built of stone and timber, weathered by time but sturdy, with smoke curling from a chimney that suggested recent use. Lyra looked at it in confusion as Darius dismounted and helped her down from the horse. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A safe house," Darius replied, leading the horse to a small shelter attached to the side of the cabin. "I had it prepared while you slept last night." We can't go back to the palace yet, not until I've made arrangements. The faction will know we've discovered something the moment we return, and I won't risk them getting to you before I can act. Lyra's stomach twisted with anxiety. How long will we stay here? A few days. Maybe longer. Darius finished securing the horse and turned to face her. I need to coordinate with the few members of my guard I know I can trust absolutely. They'll help me gather the faction members without alerting the rest of the pack. Once we have them contained, we'll present the evidence publicly and let justice be served. The weight of what he was saying settled over Lyra like a heavy cloak. This was not just about her anymore. This was about the stability of the entire pack, about rooting out a conspiracy that could have destroyed everything Darius had built. And she was at the center of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Darius opened the door to the cabin and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the space was small but comfortable. A fire burned in the hearth, casting warm light across simple furnishings. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves stocked with supplies. Someone had clearly prepared this place with care, anticipating their needs. Lyra wondered how many people Darius truly trusted, how many knew about this hidden refuge. There's food in the cupboard and water from the well outside, Darius said, setting his pack down on the table. We'll be safe here. No one knows about this place except my most loyal guards, and they won't speak of it. Lyra nodded, moving closer to the fire. The warmth felt good after the cold ride through the forest, and she held her hands out to the flames, trying to chase away the chill that had settled into her bones. Behind her, she could hear Darius moving about, unpacking supplies, preparing for their extended stay. The domesticity of it felt strange, almost surreal. Here she was, alone in a cabin with the Alpha King, far from the palace and the rules that governed their lives there. "Are you hungry?" Darius asked, breaking the silence. Lyra turned to find him holding a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. She realized she was hungry, despite the nervous knot in her stomach. They had left before breakfast, and the ride had been long. "Yes," she admitted quietly. They sat at the table together, and Darius cut the bread and cheese with efficient movements, dividing it between them. They ate in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small space. Lyra found herself stealing glances at him, studying the lines of his face, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. He looked different here, away from the palace and the weight of his crown. More human, more approachable. "Your father," Darius said suddenly, breaking the silence. "He was my closest friend. Did you know that?" Lyra looked up, surprised. I knew you were close. He spoke of you often, with great respect." Respect. Darius's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though there was no humor in it. He was one of the few people who wasn't afraid to tell me when I was wrong, who challenged me, pushed me to be better. When he died, I lost more than a beta. I lost a brother. The raw emotion in his voice made Lyra's chest tighten. She had never heard anyone speak of her father with such depth of feeling, had never realized how much his death had affected the Alpha King. "He loved you too," she said softly. "I remember, the night before he died, he told me that serving you was the greatest honor of his life, that you were the kind of leader the pack needed, even if you didn't always believe it yourself." Darius closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. "And I failed him. I failed to uncover the conspiracy he died investigating. I failed to protect his daughter after he was gone. I failed in every way that mattered." "No," Lyra said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "You didn't know. You couldn't have known. The faction hid their tracks well, and my father chose to investigate alone because he didn't want to put you at risk until he had proof. He made that choice. And as for me?" She paused, searching for the right words. "You're here now. You're trying to make things right. That's what matters." Darius opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, and Lyra felt something shift in the air between them. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," he said quietly. "Stronger than anyone gave you credit for. You survived 4 years of torment, and you didn't break. That takes a courage most warriors never possess." Lyra felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, had ever acknowledged the strength it had taken just to keep breathing day after day. "I wanted to break," she whispered. "There were nights I prayed for it, prayed for the pain to stop in any way possible. I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn." "Stubbornness is a form of bravery," Darius said. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and steady. "And you are brave, Lyra, whether you believe it or not." They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching, the silence between them charged with unspoken emotion. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt something awakening inside her, something she had thought long dead. Hope. Not just hope that her suffering would end, but hope for something more, something she didn't dare name. Finally, Darius pulled his hand away and stood. "You should rest. Tomorrow I need to leave briefly to meet with my guards and begin coordinating our return to the palace. You'll be safe here, but I need you to promise me you won't leave the cabin while I'm gone." "I promise," Lyra said, though the thought of being alone in this isolated place filled her with unease. Darius seemed to sense her fear because he added, "I won't be gone long, a few hours at most, and I'll make sure the cabin is secure before I leave." He moved to the narrow bed in the corner and began arranging blankets. "You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." But that wasn't a request. Lyra recognized the tone, the same one he had used in the palace kitchen when he had ordered her to follow him. There was no point in arguing. She rose from the table and moved to the bed, sitting on the edge and removing her boots. The mattress was thin but comfortable, and the blankets were thick and warm. As she settled in, she watched Darius arrange his own makeshift bed near the hearth, using his pack as a pillow and wrapping himself in his cloak. "Good night, Lyra," he said, his voice already heavy with exhaustion. "Good night, Your Majesty," she replied softly. "Darius," he corrected. "When we're alone, you can call me Darius." The intimacy of the request made Lyra's heart skip. "Good night, Darius," she whispered. She lay down and pulled the blankets up to her chin, staring at the wooden ceiling above her. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the trees and making the cabin creak softly. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was too full, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She was alone with the Alpha King in a hidden cabin, far from the palace and the life she had known. Her father's evidence had been found, and soon the men who had tormented her would face justice. It was everything she had hoped for and more. So why did she still feel so afraid? The answer came to her in the darkness, whispered by the part of her heart she had tried so hard to protect. She was afraid because this felt too good, too right. She was afraid because for the first time in 4 years, she was beginning to care about something other than survival. She was beginning to care about the man sleeping a few feet away, the man who had sworn to protect her, who looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. And caring meant vulnerability. Caring meant opening herself up to pain again. And Lyra didn't know if she could survive that. She must have eventually fallen asleep because she woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window and the sound of movement near the hearth. She sat up groggily and found Darius crouched by the fire, stoking the flames. He had already dressed for travel, his hair damp as if he had washed at the well outside. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder at her. "There's water warming for washing, and bread on the table if you're hungry." Lyra pushed the blankets aside and stood, suddenly self-conscious about her rumpled appearance. She smoothed her hair back and moved to the table, grateful for the bread he had left out. As she ate, Darius finished with the fire and stood, checking the weapons he had strapped to his belt. "I'll be leaving soon," he said. "I need to meet with Captain Aldrich and his men to coordinate the arrests. I should be back before nightfall, but if for any reason I'm delayed, don't panic. Just stay inside, keep the door barred, and don't answer for anyone except me." Lyra nodded, trying to quell the anxiety rising in her chest. "What if something happens to you?" Darius crossed the room in 2 strides and placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Nothing is going to happen to me. I've faced down enemies far more dangerous than a group of conspirators. I will come back, Lyra. I promise." The certainty in his voice steadied her. "I'll wait for you." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, to her shock, he raised one hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, intimate, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "Good," he said softly. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell, and moved to the door. "Remember, don't open this for anyone but me." "I won't." With a final nod, he left, closing the door firmly behind him. Lyra stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing, her skin still tingling where his fingers had brushed against her. Then she heard the sound of the horse's hooves fading into the distance, and she was alone. The cabin felt much larger without Darius's presence. Lyra moved about restlessly, trying to occupy herself with small tasks. She washed her face and hands in the warm water he had prepared, tidied the already tidy space, and even attempted to read one of the books she found on the shelf. But her mind kept wandering back to Darius, to the way he had looked at her, the way he had touched her. She had never experienced anything like it before, had never been the focus of such intense attention. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The hours passed slowly. Lyra watched the sun track across the sky through the small window, marking time by the shifting shadows. She ate sparingly from the supplies Darius had left, not wanting to deplete them in case they needed to stay longer than planned. As afternoon turned to evening, her anxiety began to grow. He had said he would be back before nightfall. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Just as panic was beginning to set in, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Lyra rushed to the window and peered out, relief flooding through her when she saw Darius dismounting from his horse. She unbarred the door and pulled it open, and he stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of pine and cold air. "You're back," she said, unable to keep the relief out of her voice. "I told you I would be." He moved past her to the fire, his expression grim. "It's done. Aldrich and his men are in position. We'll return to the palace tomorrow at dawn, and by noon, every member of the faction will be in custody." Lyra's breath caught. "So soon? The longer we wait, the more risk there is that they'll discover what we're planning and flee. We strike quickly and decisively." He turned to face her, and Lyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of what was to come pressing down on him. "Are you ready for this?" Lyra nodded, though in truth she didn't know if she was ready. Ready to face the men who had tormented her? Ready to watch them be brought to justice? Ready to step into whatever future awaited her on the other side of this? She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. "I'm ready," she said, and she hoped it was true. That night, they shared a simple meal by the fire, and the conversation between them was quieter, more subdued. Both of them were lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the reckoning that awaited them. When it was time to sleep, Lyra climbed into the narrow bed once more, but sleep did not come easily. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the sound of Darius's breathing near the fire. Sometime in the night, she woke to the sound of him moving. She opened her eyes and saw him standing by the window, his silhouette outlined by the pale moonlight. He looked troubled, his shoulders tense, his head bowed. Without thinking, Lyra pushed the blankets aside and stood, moving to join him. "Darius?" she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Did I wake you?" "No, I couldn't sleep." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you all right?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window. "I'm thinking about your father," he said finally. "About the choices he made, the risks he took. He knew the danger he was in, knew that investigating the faction could cost him his life. But he did it anyway, because he believed it was the right thing to do. I don't know if I could have been that brave." "You are that brave," Lyra said firmly. "You're doing exactly what he would have wanted you to do. You're protecting the pack, rooting out the corruption. That takes courage." Darius looked at her, and in the moonlight his eyes seemed darker, more intense. "And what about you, Lyra? What do you want?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted, had ever considered that her desires might matter. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. What did she want? Safety, certainly. Justice for her father and for herself. But beyond that, I want to stop being afraid, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to wake up in the morning and not wonder if today will be the day someone hurts me. I want to feel like I matter, like my life has purpose beyond just surviving. Darius stepped closer, and Lyra's breath caught. They were standing so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the rise and fall of his chest with each breath. You do matter, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You matter more than you know. Lyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw something that made her knees weak. Desire. Need. Something that mirrored the feelings she had been trying so hard to suppress. Darius, she whispered, and she didn't know if it was a question or a plea. He raised his hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his warrior's strength. His thumb brushed across her skin, and Lyra felt herself leaning into the touch, craving more. For a moment, they stood frozen, the air between them thick with tension and unspoken longing. Then Darius stepped back, dropping his hand, and the spell was broken. You should go back to bed, he said, his voice strained. We have a difficult day ahead of us. Lyra felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache, but she nodded and returned to the bed, her body trembling with emotions she couldn't name. She lay down and pulled the blankets up, but she could still feel the ghost of his touch on her cheek, could still see the way he had looked at her. Something had shifted between them tonight, something profound and irreversible, and Lyra knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her life would never be the same. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Darius woke her before the sun had fully risen, and they prepared to leave in silence. The weight of what awaited them at the palace hung over both of them, a tangible presence that made conversation impossible. They ate a quick breakfast, gathered their belongings, and set out on horseback just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The ride back to the palace felt longer than the journey out had been, every mile stretching into eternity. Lyra clung to Darius as they rode, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The rain grew heavier, soaking through their cloaks and chilling them to the bone, but Darius did not slow. He rode with single-minded determination, his body tense with purpose. When the palace finally came into view, Lyra felt a mixture of relief and dread. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The moment when justice would finally be served. When the men who had tormented her would face the consequences of their actions. She should have felt triumph, satisfaction, but all she felt was fear. Darius rode directly to the main courtyard, where Captain Aldrich and a contingent of guards were waiting. They were armed and ready, their faces grim with purpose. As Darius dismounted and helped Lyra down, Aldrich stepped forward and saluted. Your Majesty, everything is in place. We're ready to move on your command. Darius nodded. Good. Begin the arrests immediately. Bring them to the Great Hall. I want the entire pack assembled to witness this. Aldrich saluted again and turned to his men, issuing rapid orders. They dispersed quickly, moving with military precision, and within minutes, the palace was in an uproar. Shouts echoed through the hallways as guards moved to apprehend the members of the faction. Lyra stood frozen in the courtyard, watching the chaos unfold, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and vindication. Darius placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Come with me, he said. You need to be there when they're brought before the pack. Your testimony will be crucial. Lyra nodded and followed him into the palace, her legs trembling with each step. They made their way to the Great Hall, a massive chamber with high ceilings and stone walls that seemed to absorb sound. The pack was already gathering, summoned by the commotion, their faces filled with confusion and curiosity. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Lyra and Darius entered, and she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Darius led her to the front of the hall, where a raised platform stood. He helped her up onto it, and she stood there, exposed and vulnerable, as the pack continued to file in. She wanted to run, to hide, but Darius stood beside her, his presence a silent reassurance that she was not alone. Within the hour, the guards returned, dragging the arrested men into the hall. Lyra recognized them immediately. The faces that had haunted her nightmares, the voices that had whispered threats in the dark. There were 7 of them in total, all high-ranking members of the pack, all men who had wielded power and influence. They were brought before the platform and forced to their knees, their hands bound, their faces twisted with rage and fear. Darius stepped forward, his voice ringing out clear and strong. These men stand accused of conspiracy to overthrow the Alpha, of treason against the pack, and of the murder of my beta 4 years ago. They have tormented his daughter, believing she possessed evidence that could expose their crimes. Today, that evidence will be presented, and justice will be served. He held up the leather pouch containing the documents and the pendant, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Slowly, methodically, Darius read aloud the contents of the documents, the dates, the names, the plans that painted a damning picture of betrayal. With each revelation, the murmurs grew louder, the pack's outrage building. When he finished, Darius turned to Lyra. And now Lyra, daughter of my beta, will tell you what these men did to her. Lyra's mouth went dry. She looked out at the sea of faces staring up at her, at the men kneeling before the platform, and felt her courage waver. But then she felt Darius's hand on her back, a silent gesture of support, and she found her voice. She told them everything. Lyra's voice shook at first, barely audible above the hushed whispers of the assembled pack. But as she spoke, as she recounted the years of torment, the threats whispered in dark corners, the hands that had grabbed her and shoved her and hurt her, her voice grew stronger. She told them about the scars hidden beneath her sleeves, about the nights she had gone to bed hungry because her rations had been stolen, about the fear that had become her constant companion. She told them about the questions the men had demanded she answer, questions about documents and secrets she had known nothing about until now. And as she spoke, she watched the faces of the accused men darken with fury and fear. They shouted denials, called her a liar, claimed she was fabricating stories to gain sympathy. But the evidence was irrefutable. The documents her father had left behind proof of their conspiracy. And when Lyra finally fell silent, exhausted and trembling, the great hall erupted in outrage. The pack demanded justice. Voices rose in a cacophony of anger, calling for blood, for punishment, for the ancient laws to be upheld. Darius raised his hand, and the hall fell silent once more, every eye fixed on their Alpha King. "The evidence is clear," Darius said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "These men conspired against their Alpha, murdered a loyal beta, and tormented an innocent girl for years. Under pack law, there is only one punishment for treason of this magnitude." The accused men began to struggle against their bonds, their faces pale with terror. One of them, a man named Garrett, who had been particularly cruel to Lyra, spat at Darius's feet. "You're making a mistake," he snarled. "We were trying to save the pack from your weakness. Your father would be ashamed of what you've become." The insult hung in the air, and Lyra saw Darius's jaw clench. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, deadly. "My father taught me that a leader's strength is measured not by his brutality, but by his justice. You mistake mercy for weakness, and that mistake will cost you everything." He turned to Captain Aldrich. "Take them to the cells. At dawn tomorrow, sentence will be carried out." The guards moved forward and hauled the men to their feet, dragging them from the hall as they shouted curses and threats. The pack watched in grim satisfaction, their faith in their Alpha King reaffirmed. When the last of the conspirators had been removed, Darius addressed the assembly once more. "Let this serve as a reminder to all of you. Betrayal will not be tolerated. Cruelty toward the vulnerable will not be tolerated. We are a pack, and we protect our own. Anyone who forgets that will face the same fate as these traitors." A cheer rose from the crowd, voices raised in support of their Alpha. Darius let them celebrate for a moment, and then he raised his hand again, calling for silence. "There is one more matter to address," he said, and his gaze found Lyra standing beside him. "This girl has suffered more than any of us knew. And she suffered because I was blind to the corruption festering within my own household. That ends today. From this moment forward, Lyra is under my personal protection. She will be given quarters in the royal wing, and anyone who speaks against her or threatens her in any way will answer directly to me. The declaration sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. To be placed under the Alpha King's personal protection was an honor reserved for only the most important members of the pack. It elevated Lyra's status from that of an orphaned servant to someone of significance, someone who could not be touched without dire consequences. Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the hall upon her, some curious, some envious, some resentful, but she kept her chin raised, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Darius turned to her and offered his hand. Lyra took it, and together they descended from the platform. The crowd parted to let them pass, and Lyra walked beside the Alpha King with her head held high, even as her legs trembled beneath her. They left the great hall and moved through the palace corridors, guards falling into step behind them, until they reached a wing of the palace Lyra had never been permitted to enter. Darius led her to a set of ornate double doors and pushed them open, revealing a suite of rooms that took Lyra's breath away. There was a sitting room with plush furniture and tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in rich fabrics, and even a private bathing chamber with a large tub and heated water. It was luxury beyond anything Lyra had ever experienced, and she stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what she was seeing. "These are your rooms now," Darius said quietly. "You'll have servants assigned to you, and a guard posted outside your door at all times. You're safe here, Lyra. No one will hurt you again." Lyra turned to him, tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve this. I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You are the daughter of my beta," Darius interrupted firmly. "You are a survivor. You are brave and strong, and you deserve every comfort and protection I can provide. Don't argue with me about this." Lyra wiped at her tears, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. Just days ago, she had been scrubbing pots in the kitchen, sleeping in a cramped servants' quarters, living in constant fear. And now she was standing in rooms fit for royalty, under the protection of the Alpha King himself. It felt like a dream, fragile and unreal, and she was terrified of waking up. Darius seemed to understand her turmoil because he stepped closer and placed his hands on her shoulders, grounding her with his touch. "You're not dreaming," he said softly. "This is real. And you're going to be all right." Lyra looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw the same intensity that had been there in the cabin, the same heat that had made her breath catch. But there was something else there too now. Tenderness, care, something that went beyond duty or obligation. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Darius was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because when I look at you, I see everything I failed to protect. I see the daughter of my closest friend, suffering in silence while I was too blind to notice. I see a girl who should have been cherished and instead was broken. And I see someone who, despite everything, still has the courage to stand up and demand justice. How could I not care?" The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, cracking open something inside her that she had kept locked away for so long. She felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble, felt herself leaning into the warmth and safety Darius offered. It was dangerous, this feeling, this growing attachment, but she couldn't seem to stop it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything." Darius's hands tightened on her shoulders briefly, and then he stepped back, putting distance between them. "Rest now. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure. Tomorrow will be difficult, but you don't have to face it alone." With that, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Lyra stood in the middle of her new sitting room, surrounded by luxury and comfort, and let herself cry. She cried for the girl she had been, for the years of suffering, for her father who would never see this moment. And she cried for the man who had saved her, who looked at her with eyes that promised something she was too afraid to name. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Servants came and went, bringing her fresh clothes, preparing a bath, offering food that she barely touched. Lyra felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. She bathed in water that was actually hot, washing away years of grime and shame. She dressed in clothes that fit properly, made of fabric so soft they felt like a caress against her skin. And she sat by the window in her new bedroom, watching the sun set over the palace grounds, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. That night, she lay in the enormous bed, surrounded by pillows and blankets, and found that sleep would not come. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, the confrontation in the Great Hall, the faces of the men who had tormented her, the way Darius had looked at her when he said she mattered. She tossed and turned, her body exhausted but her mind racing, until finally she gave up and rose from the bed. She wrapped a robe around herself and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below. The palace was quiet at this hour, the only sound the distant hooting of an owl. Lyra pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions churning inside her. A soft knock on the door made her jump. She turned, her heart pounding, and called out, "Who is it?" "It's Darius." Lyra's breath caught. She moved to the door and opened it, finding the Alpha King standing in the hallway, still dressed in the formal clothes he had worn to the assembly. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before, but there was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, I just—" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't sleep. I wanted to make sure you were all right." Lyra stepped aside, silently inviting him in. Darius entered, and she closed the door behind him, suddenly acutely aware of how intimate this was, the two of them alone in her chambers in the middle of the night. But she didn't feel afraid. If anything, she felt safer than she had in years. "I couldn't sleep either," she admitted, moving back to the window. Too many thoughts. Darius joined her, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring out at the moonlit night, and Lyra felt the tension between them building, thick and electric. "Tomorrow," Darius said quietly, "the sentence will be carried out. I want you to know that you don't have to be there if you don't want to. Witnessing an execution is not easy." Lyra considered his words. Part of her wanted to be there, wanted to see the men who had tormented her face justice. But another part of her, the part that was still that frightened girl scrubbing pots in the kitchen, wanted nothing more than to hide away and pretend none of it had ever happened. "I don't know what I want," she confessed. "Then take time to decide. There's no wrong choice." Darius turned to face her, and Lyra found herself caught in his gaze once more. "Lyra, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" "When your father died, I swore I would look after you. But I failed. I got so caught up in ruling, in maintaining order, that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. And these past few days, getting to know you, seeing your strength—" He paused, his jaw clenching. "I'm not good at this, at expressing what I feel, but I need you to know that this, protecting you, being near you, it's not just about honoring your father's memory anymore. It's about you, about who you are." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to such a raw admission. All she knew was that her entire body was trembling, and the space between them felt charged with possibility. "Darius," she whispered, and she took a step closer to him, closing the distance. "I feel it too. Whatever this is, I'm terrified of it, but I feel it." Something flared in his eyes. Relief, desire, something primal that made her knees weak. He raised his hand and cupped her cheek, just as he had done in the cabin, and Lyra leaned into the touch, craving more. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "Not of this, not of me." And then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were afraid she might shatter. But Lyra responded, rising on her toes to press closer, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, and Lyra felt something inside her ignite. This was nothing like the fear and pain that had defined her existence for so long. This was warmth and safety and desire all wrapped together, overwhelming and intoxicating. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Darius rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though there was no regret in his voice. "I'm glad you did," Lyra replied honestly. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in 4 years, Lyra felt whole. She felt like she mattered, like she was more than just a victim, more than just a survivor. She was a woman standing in the arms of a man who saw her, truly saw her, and wanted her despite all her scars and brokenness. Eventually, reluctantly, Darius pulled away. "I should go. It's late, and tomorrow will be difficult." Lyra nodded, though she didn't want him to leave. Will you be there? Tomorrow?" "Every step of the way," he promised. "You won't face it alone." He left then, and Lyra returned to her bed, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. She lay down and closed her eyes, and this time, sleep came easily, carrying her into dreams that were not filled with fear, but with hope. Dawn came too quickly. Lyra woke to the sound of servants moving about in the outer chamber, preparing her for the day ahead. She dressed in the clothes they laid out for her, a simple but elegant dress in deep blue, befitting her new status, and allowed them to arrange her hair. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the girl staring back. She looked regal, composed, nothing like the frightened servant who had scrubbed pots just days before. A knock on the door announced Darius's arrival. He entered, dressed in formal armor that marked him as both warrior and king, and his eyes swept over her with an intensity that made her blush. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Lyra murmured, her cheeks warming. "Are you ready?" Lyra took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes." They left her chambers together, walking side by side through the palace corridors. The pack was already gathering in the courtyard where the executions would take place, their faces solemn. This was not a celebration, but a necessary act of justice, and everyone understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Darius led Lyra to a raised platform where they could observe without being in the crowd. Captain Aldrich was already there, overseeing the preparations, and he saluted as they approached. "Your Majesty, everything is ready." Darius nodded and took his place at the front of the platform. Lyra stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart pounding. Below, the 7 condemned men were brought forward, their hands still bound, their faces a mixture of defiance and terror. They were forced to kneel in a line, and the pack fell silent, waiting for their Alpha King to speak. Darius's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "These men have been found guilty of treason, murder, and cruelty. They betrayed their pack, their Alpha, and the memory of a loyal Beta. Under pack law, their lives are forfeit. Does anyone speak in their defense?" Silence greeted his question. No one moved. No one spoke. The condemned men had no allies left, no one willing to risk their own standing by defending them. Then let justice be done. Captain Aldrich stepped forward, and what followed was swift and brutal. Lyra forced herself to watch, to bear witness to the end of the men who had made her life a living hell. It was not easy. Despite everything they had done to her, seeing life extinguished was a heavy thing. But she did not look away. She owed it to her father, to herself, to see this through to the end. When it was over, the bodies were removed and the courtyard slowly emptied. Darius turned to Lyra, his expression grave. "Are you all right?" Lyra nodded slowly. "I think so. It's strange. I thought I would feel satisfaction, or relief, but I just feel empty." "That's normal," Darius said gently. "Justice doesn't always bring closure, but it does bring safety. They can never hurt you again." Lyra looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw understanding. He had done this for her, had brought these men to justice not just because it was his duty, but because he cared about her. And that knowledge, that certainty, filled some of the emptiness inside her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Darius reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Come, let's go inside. We both need rest." They returned to the palace together, and as they walked, Lyra felt the weight of the past 4 years beginning to lift. The nightmare was over. The men who had tormented her were gone. And for the first time since her father's death, she could begin to imagine a future that held something more than fear and pain. That evening, Darius came to her chambers again. This time, there was no pretense, no excuse. He simply knocked, and when she opened the door, he said, "May I come in?" Lyra stepped aside, her heart racing. Darius entered and closed the door behind him, and they stood facing each other in the soft lamplight. The air between them was charged, heavy with unspoken desire and emotion. "I can't stop thinking about you," Darius said, his voice rough. "I know I shouldn't. I know there are a dozen reasons why this is complicated, but I don't care about any of them." Lyra's breath caught. "Neither do I." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, capturing her lips in a kiss that was far less gentle than the one they had shared the night before. This kiss was hungry, desperate, filled with all the longing and need they had been holding back. Lyra responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his. They broke apart only when the need for air became too great, both of them breathing hard. Darius rested his forehead against hers, his hands cupping her face. "Tell me to leave," he said hoarsely. "Tell me to go, and I will. But if you don't—" "Stay," Lyra whispered. "Please stay." And he did. They spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, exploring the connection that had been building between them since that first night in the kitchen. It was tender and passionate, a claiming and a healing all at once. Lyra gave herself to him completely, and Darius treated her with a reverence that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. When dawn came, they lay tangled together in the massive bed, and Lyra traced lazy patterns on Darius's chest. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Darius was silent for a moment, his hand stroking through her hair. "Now we rebuild. The faction is gone, the corruption rooted out. The pack is safe. And you—" he tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "You heal, you live. You become whoever you want to be without fear holding you back." "And us?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we?" Darius's expression softened. "Whatever you want us to be. I'm not going to pressure you, Lyra. You've been through too much. But I want you to know that I'm here, for as long as you want me." Lyra felt tears prickling at her eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and joy. "I want you," she said simply. "I want this." Darius pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "Then you have me." They lay there as the sun rose, bathing the room in golden light, and Lyra felt something she had thought lost forever beginning to grow inside her. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for happiness, for a future filled with light instead of darkness. The nightmare was over, and the healing could finally begin. The weeks that followed the executions brought a transformation to the palace that no one could have anticipated. With the faction eliminated and their corruption exposed, a sense of renewal swept through the pack. Darius worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, to ensure that the structures that had allowed such betrayal to fester were dismantled and replaced with transparency and accountability. He held open councils where pack members could voice their concerns, established new protocols for reporting abuse and misconduct, and personally oversaw the appointment of new advisors chosen for their integrity rather than their political connections. And through it all, Lyra was at his side. It was not a position she had sought or expected, but it was one she grew into with surprising grace. Darius had not formally declared her his mate. Such a declaration carried weight and ceremony that required time and careful consideration. But everyone in the pack understood that she held a place of importance in their Alpha King's life. She was no longer the invisible orphan scrubbing pots in the kitchen. She was Lyra, daughter of the late Beta, survivor, and the woman who had captured the heart of the most powerful man in the pack. The transformation was not easy. There were those who resented her sudden elevation, who whispered that she had used her suffering to manipulate the Alpha King. that she was unworthy of the attention he lavished upon her. Lyra heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances and barely concealed sneers. But she had learned something in her years of torment. She had learned to endure. And she had learned that the opinions of those who did not know her, who had not walked in her shoes, held no power over her unless she gave it to them. Darius was fiercely protective of her, perhaps too much so. More than once, Lyra had to calm him when he overheard someone speaking ill of her, had to remind him that she could fight her own battles. "I survived 4 years of abuse," she told him one evening, after he had nearly challenged a pack member to a duel over an insulting remark. "I can survive gossip." "You shouldn't have to survive anything," Darius had growled, pacing the length of her sitting room like a caged wolf. "You should be celebrated, honored for your strength. Instead, these fools whisper behind their hands and judge you for things they know nothing about." Lyra had risen from her chair and crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest to still his restless movement. "Let them whisper," she said softly. "Their words can't hurt me anymore." "Not when I have you." Darius had pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly, and Lyra had felt the tension slowly drain from his body. This was their rhythm now. She calmed his storms, and he gave her the strength to face the world. They balanced each other in ways neither had expected, and with each passing day, the bond between them deepened. Lyra also threw herself into her training as a healer, a path she had dreamed of following before her life had been derailed by her father's death. Darius arranged for her to study with the pack's most skilled healers, and Lyra discovered that she had a natural talent for the work. There was something deeply satisfying about using her hands to mend rather than to scrub, about applying knowledge to help rather than simply to survive. The healers welcomed her with warmth, perhaps because they recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood suffering and sought to alleviate it in others. She spent her days in the healing chambers, learning about herbs and poultices, studying anatomy and the treatment of wounds. She watched surgeries, assisted with births, and sat vigil beside those who were dying, offering comfort in their final hours. The work was difficult, often heartbreaking, but it gave Lyra a sense of purpose she had never known before. She was no longer just surviving. She was living, contributing, making a difference. Her nights, however, belonged to Darius. They kept their relationship relatively private, mindful of the scrutiny that would come if they were too open about the depth of their connection. But within the privacy of her chambers or his, they were simply Lyra and Darius, two people learning to trust, to love, to heal together. Darius shared with her the burdens of leadership, the difficult decisions he faced, the doubts that plagued him in the quiet hours. And Lyra shared with him her fears, her slowly healing heart, the nightmares that still sometimes woke her in the dead of night. "I'm afraid," she confessed to him one evening as they lay tangled together in her bed, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I'm afraid that I'll wake up and this will all have been a dream, that I'll be back in the kitchen, alone and forgotten." Darius had tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "This is real," he murmured. "I'm real, and I'm not going anywhere. Promise me," Lyra whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise." It was a vow he kept with unwavering dedication. As the months passed and winter gave way to spring, Darius began to speak more openly about their future together. He spoke of making their bond official, of claiming her as his mate before the entire pack. The prospect both thrilled and terrified Lyra. To be the Alpha King's mate was to step into a role of immense responsibility and visibility. It meant facing the scrutiny of the entire pack, enduring the politics and intrigue that came with such a position. But it also meant security, belonging, and the certainty that she would never again be invisible or unprotected. "I don't know if I'm ready," Lyra admitted one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens. Spring had brought new life to the grounds, and flowers bloomed in riotous colors all around them. "What if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough to be what you need?" Darius stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face. "You are already everything I need," he said firmly. "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are, Lyra. That's all I want. That's all I've ever wanted. But the pack will accept you because I accept you. And those who don't will learn to keep their opinions to themselves." His tone was final, brooking no argument. "You've spent too many years diminishing yourself, making yourself small to avoid notice. I won't let you do that anymore. You are brave, intelligent, compassionate, and strong. You survived horrors that would have broken others. You are worthy of every honor, every happiness. And if anyone in this pack dares to suggest otherwise, they will answer to me." Lyra felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of gratitude and love. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Darius replied, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "This was meant to be. You were meant to survive. We were meant to find each other." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Lyra let herself believe him, let herself believe that she deserved this happiness, this love, this second chance at life. That evening, Darius made an announcement that shocked the entire pack. He called an assembly in the Great Hall, and when everyone was gathered, he stood before them with Lyra at his side and declared his intention to take her as his mate. The formal ceremony would take place in 1 month's time, he said, and the entire pack was invited to witness and celebrate. The reaction was mixed. Many cheered, genuinely happy for their Alpha King, and moved by the story of Lyra's survival and redemption. But others remained silent, their faces skeptical or disapproving. Lyra felt their judgment like a physical weight, but she kept her chin raised and her hand firmly clasped in Darius's. She would not cower. She would not apologize for her existence or her happiness. After the assembly, as they walked back to the royal wing, Darius seemed troubled. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy for you." "It's all right," Lyra replied, though her heart was still racing. "I knew not everyone would be pleased. Change is difficult, and I'm unconventional." "You're perfect," Darius corrected, "and they'll see that in time." Lyra wished she could share his confidence. But as the weeks leading up to the ceremony passed, she found herself increasingly anxious. The palace was abuzz with preparations, and every detail seemed to carry enormous weight. What she would wear, how the ceremony would be conducted, who would stand as witnesses. All of it was scrutinized and debated. Lyra felt overwhelmed by the attention, by the constant demands on her time and energy. She found solace in her work in the healing chambers, where she could focus on something tangible and meaningful. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before the ceremony, she was tending to a young boy who had broken his arm in a fall when Captain Aldrich appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Miss Lyra," he said, his tone formal, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Lyra's heart sank. She quickly finished bandaging the boy's arm and instructed one of the other healers to keep an eye on him, then followed Aldrich to a private chamber. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Aldrich hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We've received intelligence that there may be remnants of the faction, associates who were not present during the trials, who escaped justice. They've been quiet these past months, but our sources suggest they may be planning something." Lyra felt her blood run cold. "Planning what?" "We're not certain, but their hatred is focused primarily on you. They blame you for the exposure and execution of their leaders. We believe they may attempt to harm you, particularly during the mating ceremony when security will be more difficult to maintain with so many pack members present." Lyra sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. She had thought it was over. She had thought she was finally safe. But the past, it seemed, was not done with her yet. "Does Darius know?" "I'm informing him next. But I wanted to speak with you first, to prepare you. His Majesty will want to postpone the ceremony, to implement additional security measures. I wanted you to hear it from me before he—" "No." Lyra's voice was firm, surprising even herself. "We're not postponing." Aldrich blinked. "Miss Lyra, with all due respect, the risk—" "I've spent 4 years of my life living in fear," Lyra interrupted, rising to her feet. "I'm not going to let them take anything more from me. If we postpone, they win. They prove that they still have power over me, that they can still control my life through fear. I won't give them that satisfaction. But your safety will be Darius's primary concern, I know. And I'll accept whatever security measures he deems necessary. But we're not postponing the ceremony. We're moving forward, and we're showing them that they have no power here anymore. Aldrich studied her for a long moment, and then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You've changed, Miss Lyra. You're not the frightened girl I saw cowering in the kitchen months ago. No, Lyra agreed quietly. I'm not. And I'm not going back to being her. Aldrich nodded and left to inform Darius. As Lyra had predicted, the Alpha King's first instinct was to postpone the ceremony, to lock her away somewhere safe until the threat was neutralized. They argued about it that evening in her chambers, voices raised, emotions running high. I can't lose you, Darius said, his voice raw with fear and frustration. I can't go through that again, Lyra. I can't stand by and watch another person I love be taken from me. The admission that he loved her made Lyra's heart clench. You won't lose me, she said, moving to stand before him. But you can't keep me in a cage, Darius. I won't live like that. I've already spent too many years being invisible, being afraid. I'm done with that. If we let them dictate our lives, if we let fear win, then what was the point of any of this? The point was to keep you safe. The point was to find justice, to heal, to build a life worth living. Lyra's voice broke. I love you, Darius. I love you so much it terrifies me. But I won't let that love become another prison. I need you to trust me. I need you to believe that I'm strong enough to face this. Darius stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes dark with emotion. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I do trust you, he whispered against her hair. I do. But if anything happens to you, it won't, Lyra said, though she couldn't truly promise that. We'll be careful. We'll have guards. We'll be prepared. But we're not letting them win. Reluctantly, Darius agreed. The ceremony would proceed as planned, but security would be tripled. Guards would be stationed throughout the Great Hall and the surrounding areas, and anyone entering would be thoroughly screened. Aldrich and his most trusted men would be on high alert, watching for any sign of trouble. The days leading up to the ceremony were tense. Lyra threw herself into her preparations, refusing to let fear paralyze her. She met with the seamstress to finalize her dress, a beautiful creation of white silk and silver embroidery that made her feel like someone out of a fairy tale. She practiced the vows she would speak, the ancient words that would bind her to Darius before the eyes of the pack and the gods. And she spent her evenings with Darius, stealing quiet moments of peace amid the chaos. The night before the ceremony, Lyra couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with 1,000 different fears and hopes. Finally, unable to bear the solitude any longer, she rose and made her way to Darius's chambers. The guards outside his door recognized her and let her pass without question. She found Darius standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned when he heard her enter, and the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. No. Lyra crossed the room and slipped into his arms, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and it calmed her racing thoughts. I keep thinking about tomorrow, about everything that could go wrong. So do I, Darius admitted. But I also keep thinking about everything that could go right, about waking up the day after tomorrow with you as my mate, my partner, my equal, about building a life with you, about watching you continue to grow and heal and become the woman you were always meant to be. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. I never thought I could have this, any of this. Happiness felt like something that belonged to other people, not to me. You deserve it more than anyone, Darius said fiercely. You've earned it through every moment of suffering you endured, through every time you chose to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. Tomorrow, I get to stand before the pack and claim you as mine. It's the greatest honor of my life. Lyra kissed him then, pouring all her love and fear and hope into the connection. They made love slowly, tenderly, both of them acutely aware that this was the last night before everything changed. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled together in Darius's massive bed, Lyra felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The day of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the spring sunshine pouring through the windows like a blessing. Lyra woke early, her stomach a mass of nerves, and allowed the servants to help her prepare. They bathed her in water scented with lavender and roses, dressed her in the beautiful white gown, and arranged her hair in an elaborate style adorned with tiny flowers. When Lyra finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked regal, ethereal, nothing like the broken girl who had scrubbed pots just months before. A knock on the door announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor. One of the senior healers, an elderly woman named Mira, who had become something of a mentor to Lyra, entered carrying a small wooden box. "I have something for you," she said, her eyes warm with affection. "Something that belonged to your mother." Lyra's breath caught. "My mother?" Mira opened the box, revealing a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a crescent moon. "She asked me to keep this safe before she died. She said that one day, when you were ready, I should give it to you. I think that day is today." Lyra took the necklace with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. She remembered seeing her mother wear this, remembered the way it had caught the light when she moved. To have it now, on this day, felt like a blessing from beyond the grave. "Thank you," she whispered. Mira helped her fasten it around her neck, and then she stepped back, surveying Lyra with approval. "You look beautiful, child. Your parents would be so proud of who you've become." The words broke something open inside Lyra, and she had to take several deep breaths to compose herself. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. There was still so much ahead of her. When the time came, Captain Aldrich himself escorted her to the Great Hall. The space had been transformed, decorated with flowers and banners in the pack's colors. Every seat was filled, pack members dressed in their finest, all turned to watch as Lyra entered. She felt the weight of their gazes, some warm and welcoming, others critical and assessing. But she kept her eyes fixed on the front of the hall, where Darius stood waiting for her. He looked magnificent in formal armor polished to a mirror shine, his dark hair swept back, his expression solemn and tender all at once. As Lyra walked down the aisle toward him, their eyes locked, and everything else faded away. There was only him, only this moment, only the future they were about to claim together. She reached the front of the hall, and Aldrich placed her hand in Darius's before stepping back. Darius's fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, anchoring her. The pack elder who would perform the ceremony stepped forward and began to speak, his voice carrying through the hall as he recited the ancient words that would bind them together. Lyra spoke her vows clearly, her voice not wavering even once. She promised to stand beside Darius as his partner, to support him in his duties as Alpha King, to honor the pack and protect its members. And Darius spoke his vows in return, promising to cherish and protect her, to value her counsel, to build a future worthy of her strength and courage. When the elder declared them mated, bound before the pack and the gods, Darius pulled Lyra into his arms and kissed her. The hall erupted in cheers, and Lyra felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. This was real. She was no longer alone. She belonged here, with this man, with this pack. She was home. The celebration that followed was elaborate, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Lyra and Darius moved through the crowd together, accepting congratulations, speaking with pack members, playing the roles expected of them. But beneath the formality and ceremony, they stole glances at each other, silent promises of the private celebration that would come later. It was late in the evening, as the festivities were beginning to wind down, that the trouble came. Lyra had stepped away from the main celebration to catch her breath, moving to a quieter corner of the hall near one of the side exits. Darius was speaking with several council members across the room, and Aldrich and his guards were positioned strategically throughout the space. Everything seemed secure, controlled, which was why Lyra was caught completely off guard when a hand clamped over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her backward through the exit.